Hello, in lieu of my more typical, more cinematic style video intro, I have decided to come at you with a disclaimer, and it is most definitely because I just wanted a disclaimer, and is not because I totally forgot to film an intro for this video. The events that you will see unfold on your computer screen, or phone screen, or tablet screen, what have you, employ empirical data for the sake of the creator's argument. If you, my friendly viewer, disagree with any such interpretations, then I expect you, nay, encourage you, to voice your own opinion. In the comments, I heart engagement. Hi, my name is Uzma Ali. I have a bachelor's degree in neuroscience, which means that I am not an expert in anything, but rather a perpetual novice in everything, which I much rather prefer. On my last video, I got a comment from somebody saying that they would prefer less personality, so that should tell you about as much as this is gonna go. My goal is to make accessible and fun content for the girls, and the boys, and the non-binary people of all gender appropriations and pronouns, about questions that I ask my own self every single day. Today, that question is, how does social media posting affect the way that we perceive ourselves? I made a video on the consumer side of it, kind of focusing on brain rot and the addictive nature of short form content, but also the creator side of it really interests me, and not just like content creator influencer, I mean like the layman, I mean the Joe Schmo, how social media was originally intended to be used. I saw a lot of rhetoric online saying that we're not supposed to see ourselves this much, which is a fair assumption because way back years ago, nature's only mirrors were like a puddle in the dirt that you had to bend down and look at, and now we are bombarded with mirrors, selfies, FaceTime calls, Zoom calls, that all call attention to our own face. Social media and its almost societally obligated use of it amplifies how much we see ourselves. We can take any livable moment and transform it into content. We can refine that content to curate a specific vibe that we give off on our social platforms. My thesis, which I will attempt to back up with science, is that in this process we create an alternate version of ourselves that we see both as other and as self. This is a very philosophical concept, but I wanted to see the scientific aspect of it. What does this all look like in the brain? To answer, we're gonna have to build our knowledge here. I'm gonna walk you through number 1, our brain when thinking about ourselves, 2, our brain when looking at ourselves, and 3, our brain when looking at our cyber selves. So if you're ready to dive in, let's go.
It can get you into a lot of trouble thinking, Errol. I shouldn't do so much of it.
You know it's a video essay when they say we have to take it back to the very beginning. So let's take it back to the very beginning. Our self-concept pre-social media. For the purposes of this video, we're going to use the term self-concept to describe how we view ourselves. To get a more official definition, I guess we could say that it is the knowledge that people possess about the person they are, including traits, physical attributes, desires, beliefs, values, in-group. My own self-concept is like a reserved, maybe creative girl with brown eyes, brown face, and cherub cheeks. And I know you all hate me for serving that. I feel like one of the best ways to get a good grounding of your own self-concept is like knowing what fictional characters you can. Maybe you're MBTI type. I'm an INFP, if that tells you anything about me. To lay the groundwork for how our brain perceives our cyber selves, we first have to understand how our brain perceives our own self-concept just in the first place. This one paper sought out to answer this question. It was an fMRI study, which is my favorite kind of study, which is something that you could probably tell about me if you watch any of my other videos. You already know what an fMRI machine is. You can skip to this timestamp, but if you do not, it is a machine in which you lie. It essentially records your brain activity. You may have seen it used in a medical setting, but it is also useful for the scientists. From inside the machine, the individual inside may watch videos or view images that are put up on a little screen. So in this study, before the machine, participants were asked to fill out a couple of questionnaires identifying certain aspects about themselves, basically identifying their self-concept, like if they're tall or if they're extroverted, and they also rated how much these certain characteristics were important to their own identity. Once inside the machine, researchers gave their participants 40 little tasks that they would have to answer yes or no to. Half of these tasks would ask questions about themselves, and half of them would be grammatical tasks. The latter is just to kind of serve as a baseline for brain activity so that we can really compare what it actually looks like when we start seeing other brain parts flare up. They would switch between these two tasks in an almost randomized order, specifically isolating the brain activity that would happen while they were asking questions about the participants themselves. In that moment, we can identify what brain structures are at play when thinking about ourselves. There was really one standout member, and I'm going to have you repeat it after me just so that you can really cement it in your brain. It is the medial prefrontal cortex.
Medial prefrontal cortex. We got it, girl. Okay, that's weird.
It is important that you repeat after me because it really helps your learning. So in the case of thinking about our own self-concept, the medial prefrontal cortex, or the MPFC for short, seems to be really associated with their own self-importance. Like for the characteristics that participants thought were more important to their own self-identity, which they got from the questionnaires that they did before the fMRI machine, the MPFC activity was higher when they were asked questions about those specific characteristics. And then to get a little bit more knowledge about how the self-concept is represented in the brain, researchers ran a second phase of the experiment, asking participants questions about themselves, again, but also asking questions about their best friend to see if there would be any difference or overlap in thinking about people in general. But no siree, MPFC activation was only so strong when the participants were thinking about themselves, not when they were thinking about other people. And this kind of indicates to us that the self is really represented in the brain in the medial prefrontal cortex, which is kind of like in the front right over here. Bookmark that in your head because it's going to be a little bit important later on, alright? Hold on to it. So that's our brain activity when thinking about ourselves, but is there any difference when we're actually physically viewing ourselves? Before we take it to social media, let's just take it one step further. To mirrors.
Magic mirror on the wall, who is the fairest one of all?
Self-awareness is often divided into private self-awareness, which is how you view yourself, versus public self-awareness, thinking about how others are viewing you. This section of looking IRL is going to cover the private self versus the next section of looking online that's going to cover the public self, or the cyber self.
Famed philosopher Immanuel Kant once claimed,
"The inner sense represents to consciousness even our own selves, only as we appear to ourselves, not as we are in ourselves." And if that's confusing, that's basically kind of the separation of the object and the subject. A mirror creates another version of you if we think about it. This is the object. You are the subject, yet somehow you are the same thing. Out of the room, this does take a little bit of time for us to learn, which was observed in one of the most famous studies on mirror viewing, which is the Gallup mirror test. It started out with chimpanzees. When first exposed to a mirror, the chimps, as expected, treated their reflection as another animal and attempted to interact with it, but it was only after repeated exposure to the mirror that the chimps finally learned that their reflection was actually just themselves. To really test if they knew that their reflection was themselves, Gallup and his researcher buddies put a little red dot on these chimpanzees kind of above one of their eyebrows and then placed them in front of the mirrors. And if they reached for it on their face while viewing themselves in the mirror, then this would kind of indicate to them that, yeah, the chimps know that their reflection is themselves. And that is exactly what they did, guiding their fingers to the dot on the face while looking in the mirror, touching it, sometimes touching it and then smelling their fingers afterwards. And for humans, this skill doesn't emerge until we're about 18 months to 2 years old, suggesting that this is when we start becoming self-aware, or we start viewing our mirror selves as ourselves, melding the subject and the object together. And since I always like to know what's going on in the brain, I have another fMRI study for us, I'm sorry. This one, of course, wanted to identify what parts of the brain were active during mirror viewing. Could you have guessed that the neural regions with similar physiological properties activate both during self-face observation and other face observation? Yeah. Now you see that I'm not that crazy for suggesting that viewing ourselves in the mirror is kind of viewing like another self, that our mirror kind of creates another self of us in the brains, kinda.
it just takes a while for us to learn that this mirror self is one and the same as our self, both for chimpanzees and for humans. But this data I'm about to show you suggests that our brains may be more animalistic than we'd assume.
Specific areas in the primary visual cortex activate during face viewing. One of these is the occipital face area. I'm not gonna have you repeat these back to me because you'll see in the grand scheme of things that they're not actually important, but I do think it's a fun topic to cover and a fun little thing to learn. The occipital face area is thought to be involved in the attribution of identity, and then there's also the fusiform face area, which is thought to do more of a holistic coding of faces, as well as the superior temporal sulcus, which tends to code face expressions during face viewing. So the occipital face area tells you who the person is, fusiform face area can associate the face with the things that they have done, while the superior temporal sulcus will indicate to you what their facial expression means. When it comes to face viewing our own faces in particular, some studies have found a right hemisphere dominance, other studies have not, but the overwhelming conclusion that the literature has found is that there's really not much of a difference in our brain when viewing our own faces in the mirror versus viewing other people's faces. I mean, brain activity between the two is not identical, but there is a lot of heavy overlap. See, I thought, and you might have thought too, that there was going to be some kind of medial prefrontal cortex or MPFC activity because that was one of the brain structures that was active when thinking about ourselves that we uncovered in the first part, but it's not active when we're looking at ourselves. Most of the research on mirrors did not show any kind of MPFC activity that stood out when viewing our own selves in the mirror. So we can make an assumption, albeit hesitant, that since there is no MPFC activity when viewing ourselves in the mirror, it is kind of like viewing another self. My thesis is beginning to come together. Do we see what's going on here? Now, I do want to say that a lot of this is speculative, and I am interpreting the data of the papers that I have found in a way that supports what I think is actually happening.
But my point is that even though we teach ourselves that the mirror is us, our brain still does not code our mirror selves the same way it codes our true selves. See what I'm getting at here?
So that's ourself when we're in private, but when we're in public, specifically on social media, we are curating online versions of ourselves through stories, posts, tweets, what have you. We usually create a concept of ourselves that we are proud of perceiving. Is that a good thing? If we are able to meld the subject, us, and the object, our online selves, together, then probably we would develop a positive self-concept that would trigger positive emotions when we are viewing ourselves online. And luckily, our brains are trained for exactly that.
And yeah, thank you for watching. Gucci.
I've been actively stalking this one psychologist named Chi Wang, and she has so much good shit on like social media and the self, and we portray ourselves on social media. It's amazing. I would love to just meet her one day and like queen out together, to be honest. In one of her recent papers that came out in 2021, she proposed that the digital age has kind of brought out a triangular sense of self. 3 different prongs of you, which are all unique, but are also all still you. Kind of like the Holy Trinity, not to get sacrilegious, but it's just like a good way of describing it. First, there's the represented self. These are the characteristics, roles, experiences of the person as experienced by the person. He who acts as the experiencer and the knower. This is you and all of your glory. Then there is the registered self, which is the characteristics, roles, experience of the person that you share on social media. This is the virtual self that you show people online. Lastly is the inferred self, which is the roles, experience, characteristics of the person as viewed and interpreted by the virtual audience. This is how other people are perceiving you online. So we covered private self-awareness. Here is where the public self-awareness comes in. And for the sake of this video, I'm just going to be focusing on the social media self because there could be so many other things that we could talk about when it comes to public self-awareness, but that video is going to be too long. I just want to talk about social media. So the inferred self is how other people are perceiving you online. To get a bit of a better grasp of it, sometimes you'll meet a person, you'll love them, you'll hang out with them, you'll have a great time with them, but you'll follow each other on Instagram or something like that. You just won't really like the online version of them. That's their inferred self that you don't like very much. The represented self is the version that they put out on social media. The inferred self is how you judge them, if that makes sense. Like sometimes your registered self, how you perceive yourself online, will not match up with your inferred self, how other people perceive you online. And neither of them will ever match up with your represented self because that is only a person that you will know. No one will ever perceive you the way that you perceive yourself. And it kind of sickens me sometimes that my online self will never be fully representative of me. And I hate that. I hate that people can perceive me in a way that is not true to how I feel like I should be perceived. Because the represented self often and inevitably narrows itself down into the registered self online. Because you literally cannot share every single experience that you've ever experienced ever online. It's not possible. We do this through selective self-presentation. Sometimes we're not even doing it on purpose. It's just inevitable that we can't share everything that we ever experience online. But usually people only post the good parts of their life or the days that they look good. So when you're posting, you are likely to be thinking about yourself to be perceived in a way that optimizes your life, that optimizes your appearance. And even if you share more of the nitty-gritty of your life online, that is still sharing a version of yourself that you think is nice to share. Maybe it's not optimizing your appearance, but it could be optimizing your relatability. It could be optimizing your honesty, your humor. But unfortunately, it will never truly translate. So how does looking at our optimized online self, aka our registered self, affect us? Some studies report that social media use gives us higher self-esteem, some report lower. I think it just depends on the person, on the sample that you get in that particular study. But one of these with higher self-esteem is a 2011 paper on Facebook. In the experimental group, participants were brought in to fill a survey while a computer was sat in front of them open to their own Facebook profile, and they would have to leave the Facebook profile on while doing the little survey. And as a control, some people filled out the survey without the computer screen turned on to see if there was any difference there. The survey that they filled out was about their own self-esteem. What the researchers found was that those who had their Facebook profile open on the computer while they were completing the survey had higher self-esteem than those that did not have it open when they were completing it. What this suggests is that exposure to information presented on one's own social media profile enhances self-esteem, especially when a person uses selective self-presentation, which you are bound to do when you post online, as we covered. I mean, this data suggests that we are proud of our registered selves and have a positive self-concept of it. So even if we subconsciously consider that self as separate from us, we also kind of identify with it in a way. Perhaps it's not the worst thing to view our online selves because of the way we choose to represent ourselves online. And once again, folks, what does that look like in the brain? That's what I want to know. So yes, we have another fMRI study. Okay, yes. This final paper we will talk about today examines the effects of higher social media use on our self-concept and what that looks like up in here. This was conducted primarily with adolescents and young adults. In this study, participants reported their social media use and then went into the fMRI machine to do a couple of tasks. Here, brain activity was recorded, of course. In the self condition, participants were shown a statement and then asked to rate how much they identified with the statement. Such statements could be like, I help others, or I am smart. In the reflected peer condition, participants were shown images on the screen of unknown peers of the same age. A statement also appeared below it, this time saying, people think that I help others. Again, they had to rate how much they identified with that statement. And then there was also a control condition where participants were asked to do a classification task. I'll show you an example on the screen, and this of course is just to get a baseline of behavior. Results. Now the researchers were kind of testing a lot of things here, but for the purposes of this video, we're just going to focus on some main pieces. First off, positive self-concept was generally lower with higher social media use. What I find very interesting is the judgments of themselves online and how that correlates with the brain activity that they found. The main brain structure that lit up during this experiment was the same one that lit up in the very first study that we talked about in this video. It was the medial prefrontal cortex, or the MPFC. MPFC activity was high with higher social media use when participants were judging themselves, but MPFC activity was low when they were considering how their peers judged them. Researchers didn't expect these results, and honestly, I was a little bit surprised too, but I have a theory on what this all means. Since this is a very new topic in neuroscience, we can only hypothesize, and I'm here to offer my hypothesis. This is just preliminary food for thought that will support my thesis. And if you have another interpretation of what these results mean, by all means, please tell me what you think. I'm really just interpreting it for the sake of my argument, okay? Keep your minds open, but this is my thought process. Since heavier social media use indicates a stronger online self, or a stronger registered self, in the minds of the user, that registered self that is stronger may differentiate itself from the represented self, which is the person in all of his glory. Because you are thinking about your online self as separate from you, perhaps even a better version of you. You feel subconsciously disconnected from that self, so much so that your MPFC isn't even active. And here I'm equating that the online self is how other people perceive them. So the fact that MPFC activity was lower when thinking about how other people perceive them means that they don't think that their online self is really that tied into their represented self, or their true self. It's like how the MPFC wasn't active when we viewed ourselves in the mirror, because in our brain we kind of register that as another person. The self is supposed to be represented in the MPFC, and it's not active when these people with higher social media use are thinking about how other people perceive them, because it's not them, it's not their true selves, it's just their online version of themselves, proving the claim that posting on social media creates a separate, alternate version of yourself. Your represented self versus your registered self. Does that make sense? That is my theory. There is more data from the study, and I decided to include an appendix in this video with that extra data, but it does kind of confuse things and convolute things in a way that may not be conducive to my argument or conducive to your learning. I just thought it was way too confusing to add into the regular part of the video. Otherwise, posting on social media creates a version of you separate from yourself, and that is evident in the brain. That is my interpretation. This has not been proven in the literature. Somebody should go research that. Okay. And to conclude, what did we talk about today, guys? First, we talked about our brain when we're thinking about ourselves and how the MPFC activates during that process. Then we talked about our brain when looking at ourselves, how the MPFC is not active in this scenario, perhaps suggesting that we think that our mirror selves are a separate self. And number 3, our brain when we are looking at the online versions of ourselves, our cyber self, and how the MPFC is not as active for those with higher social media use when thinking about how other people perceive them. And how other people perceive them is probably how they present themselves online. Alright guys, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, maybe subscribe also if you want to, and turn on the notifications and all the yada 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 blah. This video was definitely a lot more speculative and definitely a lot more up to interpretation than previous videos that I've talked about, because not everything that I'm talking about has been proven in the science. You can take the data and interpret it, so that's what I've decided to do here. If you have a different interpretation, let me know, because neuroscience has not explored this topic much at all. Please, I encourage you all to think for yourselves, question me, because what I'm saying is definitely not the holy grail, okay? I only have a bachelor's in neuroscience, guys. It's a bachelor's, everybody has a bachelor's now. Okay, but that's all. I just thought it was interesting. Goodbye, and I'll see you next time. Okay, I am pondering including this because I have constructed what I think is a beautiful story after sifting through so much data that was just so confusing and hard to understand. But in this study, there was a result that kind of doesn't exactly make sense. I have a hypothesis for it, but it's just so convoluted that I didn't want to make it like an official part of the video. And I'm gonna be reading from my notes because I'm not in the mood for this, okay? What's interesting is that these participants with higher social media use did think that their peers thought of them in the same way that they thought of themselves, judging by their ratings. Self-judgment and reflective peer judgment ratings were very similar in those with high social media use and those with low social media use. And the way that I interpret it is like slightly contradictory to the hypothesis that I just offered. I don't want to exclude data, but I also don't want to make things super convoluted. If this is too much for you, you are free to just click off. Although people with higher social media use feel disconnected to this registered self that they portray on social media, which is what I was just on about, they may force themselves to identify with the registered self because it's the better version of them, thereby answering these fMRI questions about themselves in a way that aligns with the version that they want to be, the version that they portray online. So that's why these judgments of themselves and judgments of how they think their peers judge them were so similar for those that had higher social media use. And their registered self is the closest idea in their heads of what others get to see of them online, so they convince themselves that they're like the version of the person that they put online, which is what their peers get to see. And in this way, self-judgments and reflected peer judgments are almost identical. So before I was arguing that they felt disconnected with this version of themselves, and now I'm arguing that they're forcing to identify with it at the same time. I know that that's really confusing. I don't know, it's weird, you guys. And all of that, what I was just saying about the MPFC activity, that was just my interpretation. The researchers offered a completely different interpretation, and I can tell you what that means right now. The lower MPFC activity for the reflected peer judgments versus the self-judgments was supposed to point to the fact that imagining how peers reflect about you requires less effort and is more automatic. I didn't agree with that. And they also do say that this is preliminary hypotheses that should be confirmed in future studies, so we can't rely on them either. We can't rely on me, we can't rely on them. I just wanted to share because yes, I can construct a whole story that makes a good amount of sense from front to end, but there will be pieces that don't quite make sense. And since this is all very new stuff, you deserve to know. Accessibility, woo!